You might have heard about a pamphlet back in 2018 that Sweden handed out to every household in their country. It was a way for their citizens to be better prepared for the possibility of conflict or a crisis. But when you read this pamphlet during today's context, some of the information in it will blow you away. Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and today we're talking about the Swedish war pamphlet that was put out in 2018 in order for their citizens to be better prepared for the possibility of conflict, of any kind of a crisis, or whatever it might be that comes in the future. Like I said, this was put out in 2018, so it seems like they might have had some ideas about things going south relatively soon. Now, this brochure was given out to every single household in Sweden, and it was developed by the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. And they put it together so that their citizenry would have better information about how to be prepared, as well as what they should expect to deal with during a time of crisis. And if you think that the United States should do something similar for its citizens, then hit the subscribe button below, because once you read through this pamphlet, you're going to be very concerned about the fact that something like this doesn't exist for us, okay? So I will link this pamphlet in the description below, as well as in the pinned comment, where you'll also find ways you can support the channel and everything else. But I want you to take a look at it, because for anyone who's a prepper, this is good information. There's a lot of stuff you can digest within this brochure. It's a very short read, and it gives you some things to really think about when it comes to national security, more so than just your personal preparedness, okay? So, first and foremost, in big, bold letters in the first page of this brochure, they say, keep this brochure. They want all of their citizens to have this information. And this should give you something to think about, because we don't have something like this right now in the United States, and I'm sure in your country, unless you're in Sweden, you probably don't either, especially something this updated. We're talking 2018, all right? Now, the first section of this brochure is about emergency preparedness. So that's how important that is to dealing with conflict or crisis of any kind. And they're telling the citizenry there that this is extremely important. They got to prioritize it, okay? And for emergency preparedness, in the event of a societal emergency, help will be provided first to the people who need it most. The majority must be prepared to cope on their own for some time. That's exactly what it says in that passage of this brochure. And that's exactly how you should approach the idea of conflict or crisis. Sure, the government might still exist and may try to help people, but people will be prioritized based on need of care. And you might not necessarily need care just because you have a broken leg when the other person is missing their leg. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind there that they're trying to let everyone know. You're going to be on your own. The majority of you will be. And that's what they told their citizens. They're not afraid to admit it, because they want them to be better prepared to operate without them if need be, okay? Now, very interesting, and this is what I really wanted you to pay attention to and why I wanted to bring this pamphlet to your attention, okay? Like I said, 2018, 3 years ago, all right? Interesting that this is the second section of the brochure, which is how to identify false information, okay? And now I'm gonna reference some notes here really quick, and I'll definitely have some screenshots going up here so you can see what's happening here in this brochure. This is extremely informative. This is something you definitely want to pay attention to, especially based on what's been happening for the last year and a half, okay? So here's how they say you can identify false information and how you should critically think about the information that's being given to you, all right? Is this factual information or is it opinion? These are questions you're supposed to ask about the information you're receiving, okay? What is the aim of the info? Who has put it out? Is that source trustworthy? Is this information available elsewhere? Is this information new or old, and why is it out there at this precise moment, okay? Those are all very good questions to ask about any form of information that you are receiving. And they're literally telling their citizens to watch out for propaganda. And they know that during conflict or a crisis of any kind, that propaganda will be running rampant. Now, apply this to today's situations, and you'll see why I find this to be so eye-opening and why this is such an interesting brochure for them to be passed out to their entire citizenry. This is a very important thing they're doing for their people, which is not being reciprocated around the world, okay? Now, the next section is about total defense and how that's a combination of military and civil defense, and how everybody bears a responsibility to help each other out in the time of crisis or conflict, okay? And Sweden resumed strengthening their total defense due to the world changing. And back in 2018, a lot of that seemed like what was related to happening, in the sense of Russia and aggression and stuff like that. But we can all see that maybe things have changed a little bit in that regard, but they're still strengthening their total defense based on how they've seen the world change. So this is another important factor there that they, maybe had a crystal ball about, okay? So, here's some other interesting information for you. Home preparedness is the next section. And home preparedness has a good list of different things that they think every citizen should have on hand and ready to go in case of an emergency, okay? And I'll have that flashed up here on the screen, but I also want you to make sure to check out the brochure in the description or in the pinned comment so you can see for this list yourself, and then you can also see if you actually match up with what's on it, okay? And the basics categories that are within this list are food, water, warmth, comms, and other. So they prioritize food and water, which makes sense, but then warmth, because they live in a cold environment and we know what the cold will do to people if they're not prepared for it. And then comms. So communication is extremely important in the times of conflict or crisis, especially when you relate that information back to that second section, which was about identifying false information. You can see how this is all kind of tied in together. And then other is just a lot of other random accessories or equipment you might want just based on survival, okay? So here is some very good info in that packet as well that I feel deserves a reading into, okay? So if Sweden is attacked, resistance is required. Potential attacks include, and here's what they list as potential attacks. This is why this is so interesting with what's been going on in the world, okay? Cyber attacks, understandable. Sabotage of infrastructure. Yes, large-scale terror, of course, okay? But then it gets a little more interesting. And this is why I really wanted to bring this to your attention. You might have heard about this pamphlet back in 2018, but applying today's context to it turns it into a whole different ballgame, all right? The other forms of attacks that they think are potential is attempts to influence Sweden's decision makers or inhabitants. I'm gonna let you sit on that one for a second, and actually, I'll go ahead and repeat it. Attempts to influence Sweden's decision makers and or inhabitants. Just attempts to influence, okay? And the next potential threat is severed transport links that result in a shortage of foodstuffs and other goods. And finally, ending with straight up military attacks. Okay. You heard all of that correctly, right? Okay, now, I want you to really pay attention to this little section here that Sweden put together that they wanted their citizens to understand and to know. And this is how concerned they are about false information circulating during conflict or crisis, okay? If Sweden is attacked by another country, we will never give up. All information to the effect that resistance is to cease is false. They told their people, every single household in their country, that you know what? We aren't going to give up. So if anyone tells you otherwise, it's a lie. Don't give up, continue to resist, okay? They said that it is a responsibility of the people to resist. And this is how they're saying it. It's gonna happen no matter what, and it's gonna keep going forever until it can't go anymore. And that's a very interesting thing for them to put into this brochure. This is how concerned they are about the way the world has changed, and this is how concerned they are about their citizens being able to survive whatever's coming their way, okay? And then the last section is about warning systems, which is something a lot of people probably need more information on, which is something that, we don't have just handed to us here in the United States. But the warning systems tells you about, public announcements, tells you about alarms and air raid warnings, and it tells you about where shelters or places of protection exist for you to go to during these times of crisis or conflict. This brochure is very short. It's not a lot of information to digest, but it's full of great information. And it's also full of a lot of thought-provoking things that, when you apply them to today, make you wonder whether or not countries like Sweden think that they're possibly within a crisis or conflict as of right now. And this is something you have to really think about. I find it very eye-opening that they prioritized on the second page how to identify false information. They gave their citizens critical thinking points as to how to detect false information. And then they go through and talk about how possible attacks that they're preparing for include things like attempts to influence their decision makers or their people, and possible issues with the supply chain leading to food shortages and other goods. That's why I wanted to bring it to your attention. You might have thought about it, or you might have seen it 3 years ago. But wow, does it change a lot of things when you actually look at it now, doesn't it? So, like I said, it's in the description, it's in the pinned comment. Take a look at it, download it. Even if you don't live in Sweden, maybe this is something that gives you some decent information to think about, and maybe it's something that we should be asking for. But we won't, because let's be honest, we know that the people who would be putting out this information are probably no longer really on our side. So, with that being said, hopefully this gave you some things to think about, and hopefully you can take what's in this brochure, apply it to today's context, and really understand the way things are going. And without anything else to say about it, that's going to be it for Magic Prep.